Hello everyone, my name's Moyra Falkinder, and these are a few random memories I have as a young child when I grew up in Amamore during the 1950s and into the later 1960s. Yeah, it's something from the 1950s that relates to now, 2021, and the topic of the COVID vaccines is when we received our polio vaccinations. I was quite young at the time in that I don't think I was very far into school, would have been probably getting towards the mid-1950s. And my recollection of it is that we were carpooled and taken from Amamore School over to Kandanga. Now, I have in my mind that it should be the Kandanga Hall, but I'm not sure whether it was a hall or the school. But they are across the road from one another. And I do have in my mind lots of people, very long lines, taking quite a while. And I do remember that the needles, I can't remember whether it hurt or anything like that, but I do remember that the needles weren't as fine, and the whole procedure that it's used now wasn't as what would you say, wasn't as slick as it is now. And then we must have been driven back. That must have taken some time. And I just have a feeling it might have taken over a couple of days. I can't recall any buses. I don't think there were any school buses around at that time. They didn't seem to exist until about the early 1960s. So that was probably about 1956 or 5 or something like that. And I think I can't remember any of the background chatter about it, but it must have been of very great concern to all the parents, because there were a couple of children in our school and others in the district who actually did contract polio and did have lifelong consequences from it. The ones who I knew, they weren't so serious, they impeded their life, but they did have slight disabilities. But I was aware of words like Salk, the Salk, S-A-L-K vaccine, and the word vaccination and things like that, but I can't, remember any of the information and chatter that's going on now about this one. So that's just one early thing I recall. No, we must have got our TB needles. Remember TB was a concern in my childhood, but I think maybe that was during my high school. No, I don't, but there were always these awful influenzas like Urti. Dad caught Urti, which was an acronym for respiratory tract infection. Well, it's probably one of the flus we get now. And he was sick for weeks and weeks in bed, and probably for about 6 weeks. But other than those sorts of things, I can't remember anything else, no. Well, I didn't either, and I had to look that up, but I remember him having that. And Dad was a school teacher out there, so they had to get a relieving person in, which in those days wasn't really a terribly easy thing to do. So I was born in Gympie in 1951, and we went to live at the end of Schoolhouse Road, which was at the back of Amamore Village near the railway line and the river. And I stayed there, and I came for my secondary education at what was the Gympie Convent, which is now part of St Patrick's College. And then I would have left, I think I finished in 1967, then I went to Brisbane to go to uni. And I haven't really ever been back. Oh, just a few odd visits, but not, no. But I'm like that. When I leave somewhere, I leave it behind. Although we have lived in this district, like John and I had a farm out at Wilson's Pocket. I was transferred back here, and I ended up staying here, and so we've lived here now. We live in Gympie now for probably 49 years now. Well, I went to Brisbane beginning of 1968, and I did teacher training, and I went to university, and then your teacher training was an emergency training system, which they kept going for many years. And then I went to Kelvin Grove College, and then I went to Maroochydore High School to teach. and thought, well, this is nice, I'd like to stay here for a while. And then I got transferred. I didn't apply for a transfer, but I got transferred back to Gympie High School, which I wasn't so happy about, but it was a great place to work. So that was, 3 or 4 years. Yeah, and then by that stage, Mum and Dad lived in Horseshoe Bend. And then John and I got married and moved to Wilson's Pocket not so long after that. I'll just talk about my very brief memories of Barumba Dam. Around it would be the very early 1960s, I think. Barumba Dam started to be built. Again, I can't remember anything about the background of it and the back chatter at all. And of course there was an influx of workers to the Merry Valley, and then a lot of people in the Merry Valley townships went to work there as well. The bit I recall specifically is there are a lot of mid-European and Northern European people came, which was interesting in that they looked different from us, because most of us had, a lot of us had Irish backgrounds and English backgrounds. A lot of us were dark haired and whatever, and they were beautiful white skin, white hair. And some of them had their families with them. Not all of them did, but some of them. And I suspect those families had followed them around the construction that had occurred post-war, because the Snowy Mountains things had started to develop, and there were a number of dams being built around the east coast, eastern part of Australia. And I guess they didn't want to live in the vans and the dongas up there, and they found houses in the townships. And one particular family I remember were from Norway, and they lived in Ammermoor Township, just a street down from the school. And one of the daughters, they had 4 children, I think, one of the daughters was in my class, and we were all pretty fascinated by Anne because she had the beautiful straight white blonde hair. She spoke very good English, but with a very crisp accent. So I would say they had been around various places in Australia. And she wasn't much bothered about being early for school or missing school. That was sort of important to all of us in those days. And I think it was because of the interesting lifestyle they'd lived. And the other thing was, in wintertime, she always came with her beautiful sweaters, with the patterns on them. And I always remember that, which her mother would have knitted. And I remember that they went backwards and forwards to Norway over the years. I don't know how many years. It was probably 3 or 4 they lived in that house. But members of the family did go backwards and forwards. And I have an inkling that a grandma came out at one stage too, to stay there. So that sort of, in a way, opened up the world for a lot of us to think, well, okay, all these people live on the other side of the world, and they come to places like the Merry Valley. And so that's the aspect I remember. Another thing was that became a bit of a tourist attraction, I suppose, in a way. And odd weekends, Dad had, we'd drive up and have a look at the progress, and I remember all the vans all lined up, which we couldn't quite believe that all that beautiful ground was all covered with all of this. But so they're my small memories of Barumba Dam. I don't know where they went, but one of the elder sisters, she stayed, and I think she married someone in the community. I don't know what happened there. But I did see Anne a few years later, wouldn't have been too many years later, on a New Year's Eve I was out at the Jockey Club with my sister and her husband and some other people, and I saw her in the distance right over the room, but I didn't ever get a chance to speak to her. So I suspect they kept on doing the same thing, was coming backwards and forwards to link up with their family again. Yeah, it was lovely. It's a lovely memory. I suspect some of those families who came here probably stayed in places in the valley, or else moved somewhere else and they stayed in Australia. One other thing I just recalled then, though, there were Italian farm workers in Ammermoor and Kandanga area, and I think that was even before the dam was built, because I remember a little girl when I was there in grade 1 or 2 who was Italian, but I don't know what happened to them either. But I used to be pretty interested in them because they were different, but I don't ever remember. You know how they often talk about when they're interviewed about their food? I don't remember any of that.
Wow.
And I think Anne went home, the Norwegian girl, I think she went home every day for her lunch because she lived just through the fence of the school ground. So, yeah, and I was a bit miffed about that because that's one thing that they always mention, how they had different food from everyone else. The house where we lived, the house yard backed onto a paddock which went down to the railway line, which ran parallel to Amamore Creek, and it was on the Kandanga side of Amamore. It was between Amamore and Kandanga, so it was, you can imagine the rail traffic going from it, having stopped at Amamore, gone up to Kandanga, so we were on that side of the line. And when I was a little kid, before I went to school, your day was punctuated by all of the rail traffic. There was a lot of rail traffic, and we had a high-set house at the back, and I used to sit out on the back steps and watch all the rail traffic going. And there were various types of rail transport. There was, on Monday mornings very early, the rattler would go out to go up to Bruloo to bring the kids into high school, but that was the first one of the week. I think it stayed out there every other night. So it went up really early. That would have been, 5 or 6. And then it would come back through, and, that'd take it was quite a long trip from Bruloo into Gympie with the school kids. And then there'd be the goods trains going up to collect the pineapples and boxes of beans and whatever. And then there'd be the timber trains going through, and then there'd be the fettlers going through, and then there was the odd passenger train. They weren't necessarily daily, with the beautiful carriages they're now using for the Heritage Railway. And I can sort of remember all that because that was a bit of entertainment for me as a little child. And the railway line was above the road at that time, so that when it flooded, which seemed to be all the time, but when I look at the levels of the old Normanby Bridge and the creeks we used to ford, was any wonder it seemed like all the time, but the railway still was able to operate. And as I've been thinking about it, I realised how much the community really depended on the rail and the line. And our address, our residential address, always included Amamore Mary Valley line via Gympie. And I'd never thought about it at the time, and I was thinking about that recently, and I thought, well, that's because the mail was sorted and the mail bags went on to the rail motor for that delivery, for that line, because we depended on it for our mail. And I was a bit miffed probably when the Heritage Railway put their train together, because the rattler I remember was the old rust red rail motor with all the kids hanging out the windows, waving to everyone on the way through. And it used to screech and scream around the rails. I didn't go on it very much because there were buses by the time I went to high school. But people used to go on that to go to Gympie, to go to the doctor, do their shopping and all that sort of thing. But I realised later on, I had to use the lovely carriages because it was a bit safer than that for a Heritage Railway. And at the station, someone's probably already told you this, but there was always the goods shed with the fruit and vegetables in it and the pineapples, and they'd collect all of those or drop them off. And that was very busy. There were always people all day coming down, dropping off their boxed up or they were in crates then, produce. And there was a person who worked there sort of permanently, and then they were loaded onto the carriages that were then shunted on, and then they'd be attached, I guess, on the way back. And the mailbag was dropped off every afternoon from the rail motor, and that was as the children came through from high school to come off. And that was a fairly important event, and people the post office would close, it was beside the shop, and then it'd take about half an hour, all the mail was sorted, and then we could go and collect our mail. And the Mrs. Dunn, who was the station mistress, she lived just across the way, and she had the job of opening and closing those gates all day, which was a fairly busy job. That was across Busby Street, and where the rail line still is. And that was her job, I recall. Occasionally some kind person would see her coming and do it for her. At the time, I didn't think anything of that, but it would have been quite a job. So that's my recollection of the rail. She was there the whole... That would have happened, I guess, at Dagan. Oh, Kandanga, I just can't recall. I can't recall what side of the road the railway was on. And probably at Imbil and Bruloo, I would say. And see, that was just and some of the goods for the shop would have come on the train in the early days as well. But I just can't remember that, but I guess I wasn't there to see that happen. I hadn't realised till I went to write that up how much it had imprinted on my memory and how much it meant to me as a little kid, because obviously I entertained myself on the back steps while Mum was working. This one's about the music that I've told you about, which is it's probably a bit of a ramble here, but I just thought, well, just as there's a lot of music in Gympie, and that originated with the gold rush when all of the different cultures and a lot of Irish people came here, and I guess, that accompanies it, and that had spread into the Merry Valley townships. There was a lot of music-related things, like there were heaps of country dances, and they must have had some sort of a roster because they were on Friday nights, I think, and they seemed to be around the place, but I didn't ever go to a country dance. My parents were not that way inclined, and there were lots of concerts on, including school ones and fancy dress balls, and there were also church festivals and the music with the church. We had our family used to worship at a church at Kandanga, and we used to go. Dad was a fairly keen churchgoer, and we used to go most Sundays. Well, we always sang something during those church services, and then at certain times of the year the mission priest would come and there'd be even more singing. And I realised when I got older that I quite liked church singing is because of that. But anyway, getting back to it, and there were always marching bands on the sports days. We all played the fife, which must have just sounded dreadful as we were marching along. And there were always bands. There were always either family bands or young blokes around. There was always a band available for everything that they wanted. And as well as that, I'm getting to my point, there was our travelling music teacher, and that was Mr. Williams. And I don't know whether anyone's told you, but in the early times when we were there in the 50s, the doctor always used to come out weekly and set up in the hall and do whatever. Mum used to take me down to get weighed and things like that. I don't know how long that lasted for, and I don't know if they came every week. But Mr. Williams used to come every week, and he went from Dagan through to Imbil, and I think it was over 3 days, and the students from Bruloo who wanted to learn, they would come into Imbil, and I have a feeling that our day was Wednesday, so I'd reckon he started at Dagan first and had a few students, and then he used to set up in the hall for the day. And then we would walk down the Amamore School's on a hill where it still is, and we'd walk down what we used to call the big hill, down to the main street. And I've realised in later years, I was thinking, oh, gee, we were allowed to do all that by ourselves. But the teachers could actually see us from the veranda, making sure we got there or we were safe and things like that. And I've been thinking he's either stayed at the Kandanga Hotel or the Imbil Hotel. I think it was the Kandanga Hotel. And I do feel he was quite optimistic for our progress because we were only country kids, and we got a piano eventually. We bought one. But I know some of the other children wouldn't have had a piano. That would have been the only time they touched the piano. But we had that piano all the time. I gave it to my daughter just last year when COVID was on, so she could teach her daughter the piano. So that's been in our family all that time, be over 60 years. But anyway, as I said, he was quite optimistic, and as well as learning to practically play the piano, we had to do theory, and none of us were very keen on that. But not only that, he used to enter us in the exams in the Trinity College of London and the AMEB exams, and also later on, as we became a bit more competent, he'd put us in the Gympie Stedford, which, as you know, they've always been fairly big events, and they were well contested in those days. And then I can recall and we used to go, I'm not sure whether we went for a half-hour lesson or whether we did half an hour theory while the other person, like there were always two of us there, half an hour theory while the other person did had their piano lesson, and then we swapped over. And then I can remember my lesson went into the lunch hour, so I didn't miss much school. Somebody made sure I didn't miss too much school. And then we had to do these theory exams and go to the central school, which was just the brick building that's there now. And they were on a Saturday morning. Every extracurricular thing was on a Saturday morning in those times. And I can just remember going there. We were given this card and it had your name on it and what class theory exam you were doing. And there were all these people, because everyone from all over the district, all the kids were all doing various grades of theory exams. And I was just absolutely overcome because I went to a little country school. And anyway, we all seemed to pass our exams quite well. And I think now I mightn't have been I didn't do too badly in my theory exams, but maybe they were fairly technical and easy, I don't know. But I think now it was very good preparation for when I was to go to different places, to go to Brisbane later on, to go to college and go to uni, because then I knew what it felt like to be the strange person thinking you're the only person in the world. So I think Mr. Williams and Mrs. Williams, his wife, she was very well known. She was the better musician of the two, and they were up on Red Hill. You might know this from other people have told you. And they had an old Queenslander up on Red Hill next to the Phoenix Hotel, which I think the driveway was their house. And a few weekends before the exam, Mr. Williams would invite us in on Saturday afternoon, and we would play for Mrs. Williams because she, as I said, she was the better musician, and she'd give us all the etiquette of how to be in a music exam, because you had to prepare your stool and then sit down and put your music out a certain way, and you had to answer the questions. You had questions as well, and do all that. And she would show us all of that. So I think probably that Mr. and Mrs. Williams, over the many years, they did all that for lots and lots of people all around Gympie. They helped a lot of people with growing confidence and, to widen their horizons a little bit. So I think they did a great service to the community as well as to the Mary Valley. They were crucial to the Mary Valley. After we did our music exam, you could go out to you had to go in the front door and out the front door, and then we go down the steps, up her side kitchen steps, and she had this beautiful morning tea or afternoon tea laid out for us. She'd obviously been cooking for days beforehand, and that was our reward for doing our exam. Even though I was never a terrific musician, I had the opportunity, and I really love music and listening to it, and love going to musicals and things, and I put it down to them. And my parents too, for, letting us learn music. I just think now that life as a child, that was mainly my earlier childhood, up until probably mid-1960s. I think, looking back, it was pretty good. And most things that we wanted were within our reach, like Gympie, which was a long, rough drive, but we used to go to Gympie every Saturday morning mostly and buy our groceries and things. It was everything was within reach, as I've just sort of pointed out through the music and things to you. And I remember that the people in Amamort, they were really hardworking and they were committed to the community, but they were very generous with their produce. Often we'd find a big case of little pineapples on the porch at the back, or the lady next door always had the bag of mangoes for you. You know, that sort of thing existed, which still does in little places, and they were helpful. But I always thought if something wasn't right, they weren't happy about something, they were always willing to speak out, and that's been borne out through the years, through our more recent history, that they like things to be as they should be. And also another point, in those times people didn't go to those little country towns for a lifestyle like they do now. They go and live somewhere out in New South Wales where there's a cafe and all the rest. They went there to work because there was a reason to be there. There was a job to do, or a family to look after, or someone that they had to help. So there was always a reason for them being there, and I think the communities always worked pretty well. But that's a good thing too, because it's alive again. You know, as you know, it died for that time, and it's alive again because there was nothing nicer. We always used to go to during the 6 weeks holiday. Dad came from Northern Rivers, and we always used to go down to Mullumbimby, Brunswick Heads, all those areas that are now sort of in. They were where we went for our holidays as kids, and you drive back in along the highway and you'd look up and you'd see the pineapple patches and I suppose the patchwork of the ground getting ready for the bean crops the coming year and things like that. And it was always beautiful. It always looked lovely. Dad he was born in Wollumbar, I think, and then they lived all around that area and eventually had a dairy farm up at, it's up near Nimbin now, but it was called Moyra. I never heard, Nimbin apparently existed, but I never heard it ever mentioned, so it mustn't have been a town, it must have just been a place. Dad's family had this dairy farm up at Moyra, and they lived in a big, they had a big family, and they'd been lucky enough to win the casket, so they built this great big house in Mullumbimby, and Dad was sort of the only one who was educated to a high level. He went to Lismore High School on the train, and then he went to a boarding school in Armidale. But the others went into the forces during the war. So Dad was a bit older. That's why I have that memory of driving back from after our holidays of looking at the hills. I miss the thing I didn't talk about, which was the sports. I really liked that. It was really well organised, really highly organised, because that was the way that people were, and the sports were held in the varying communities, like Bidagan one year, Amamort one year, Kandanga, and there would be a sports committee, and then they organised to prepare the ground and get everything done up. And then of course the ladies would make all the beautiful food that I suppose we bought it. I don't know whether I think we probably bought it, and that was a fundraising thing. And then that's why we played the fife. We'd have the march past in the morning, was it? I think. And then in the afternoon there'd be the presentation of sashes. And I've always liked organised sport, and it used to irk me a lot when I went to these various schools I taught at, and their sports carnivals were always terrible, and the swimming carnivals were always ill-organised, and that's why, because but then I was quite good I used to run, so it all sort of meant a lot to me. Yeah, I was a bit of a runner, short distance. I peaked at about 9. Well, my father had been an excellent athlete, and he was a good runner too. My son inherited, he's quite good too. Not that he ever used it. Oh well, I don't know. He probably did at Central School. I can't recall. But I always like a good sports carnival. I always like watching the the athletics and the Olympic Games and the swimming, and, you know, that's something that has stuck with me. The other thing that has stuck with me, which you'll laugh at, that I recall, is the butcher shop that was in the main street. And when I was there, Mr. and Mrs. Deem owned it, and often it was my job. Mum used to sweep the school rooms every afternoon, and then sometimes it was my job to go down the hill to the butcher shop. It was at the bottom of one hill onto Busby Street, and buy the meat. And of course I can always remember the string hanging down, the sawdust on the floor, and he had beautiful, beautiful meat. It was top class wherever he got it from. It was probably local. And then a couple of years ago, a friend of mine said something about this cafe at Amamore, and then we went out and then she took me out, and it was in the old butcher shop, and the house yard was still there, and they had it all planted up with trees and things like that. So that brought back a beautiful memory of something that I guess was important to us, because I was doing the shopping for Mum.